Um, there we go. Okay, so it's my great honour to welcome Ramachandra Guha to the Sporting History podcast, brought to you by the British Society of Sports History. And it's also a great honour to announce that Ram is the recipient of the Howard Milton Award for Cricket Scholarship for this year, which was just announced at the BSSH conference. So congratulations, Ram.
Thanks, Geoff. It's a great privilege and an honour to be to have your work recognized, particularly by one's peers. So I'm very pleased indeed with the Howard Milton Award.
Yeah, and I was just talking to Ram before we kind of started the recording here about his landmark work, which was A Corner of a Foreign Field, which was published in 2002. And I'm sure I'm not the only sports historian who has read that book with pleasure, but also with slight envy, because the scholarship is so good and the style is so readable. Can you tell me how you first started on the project of A Corner of a Foreign Field?
So, Geoff, there's a kind of prehistory to it, which particularly for your British members or non-Indian members in general, I should say a little bit about. My first cricket book was actually published 10 years before A Corner of a Foreign Field, and it was a fan's book about cricket. It was not a historian's book. It was called Wickets in the East, and it was about Ranji Trophy teams. It was followed 2 years later in 1994 by a second slim fans book celebrating the great cricketers of the 1970s whom I had grown up watching and admiring. So and then shortly afterwards, I started a fortnightly cricket column in the Hindu newspaper of Chennai, one of our leading newspapers, English newspapers, where I wrote about great matches. If a famous player died, I mourned his death, I marked anniversaries. I wrote about the ducks Bradman had made rather than about his centuries and so on and so forth. So I had kind of two parallel careers, Geoff. I had a kind of a weekend career as a cricket fan writing about the game I love. And during the week, I wrote scholarly works on ecology, politics, and so on and so forth. And it so happened that the great hero of Corner of a Foreign Field is a character called Palwankar Balu, whom I knew of from my cricketing fandom as India's first top-class spin bowler. And then in the course of my academic research, I also discovered that he was a public figure. He came from a Dalit or untouchable background and had played a part in a very important controversy in Indian political history, which was about affirmative action for untouchables. So I was kind of gobsmacked. I said, hey, this great cricketer is also a public figure. And then my two worlds began to meet, the world of a historian and the world of a cricket fan. And I began to see sport not merely in terms of aesthetic pleasure, but in terms of reflecting the prejudices, passions, and of course, divisions and fault lines within Indian society. That's how Corner of a Foreign Field was born.
Yeah, that was definitely what I got from the reading of it, because I read it just this week. That kind of intersection between the practice of sport, but also its social impact and the way in which it can promote people's careers or people up society, or close them off as well. And so one of the great themes of your work is the development of the quadrangular, pentangular tournament in Bombay, or Mumbai as it is now, and how this tournament was quite controversial in India. Maybe you can explain some more about what the tournament was and why it was so controversial, especially in the 30s and 40s.
So, Jeff, the origins of this tournament, which was Indian cricket's premier first-class tournament. There was no Ranji Trophy before 1935. And top-class cricket in India was born by teams organized by racial or religious lines. So the Parsis, who were the most westernized of Indian communities, mostly based in Bombay, started seeing British soldiers play cricket and took to the game themselves. And then the Hindus emulated the Parsis and the Muslims emulated the Hindus in a spirit of competitive rivalry. And the British liked to organize Indians in terms of communities. They didn't like identifying Indians as individuals with distinctive histories. They clubbed them under these categories, Parsi, Hindu, Muslim, which were partly artificial and partly real. And that's how the tournament arose. It was played every year in Mumbai. It was fiercely competed for. There were daily reports on it in the newspapers all across India. There was live radio commentary. There was extraordinary excitement before the tournament on things like team selection and, who would be captain, which team had the better chance, and so on and so forth. So it was really Indian cricket took, at least in terms of competitiveness and quality, really took shape through the quadrangular, which in the year 1935 became a pentangular for the reason that suddenly it was found that there were some first class Christians who were Indians, who had no place in these four categories. And the simplest solution would have been to let them play for the European team, but racial boundaries did not allow it. So a fifth catch-all category called the rest was created, which comprised Indian Christians as well as Jews and a few Buddhists from Sri Lanka who also played in this tournament. So it's rather odd kind of a hold all, catch all category, this was played on the Bombay Maidan, which many of you know, and with shamianas and great excitement and barracking and slogans and cartoons. So I mostly researched this tournament through the local newspapers. In fact, as a historian, in my professional work, I normally used either government records or private manuscripts and letters. But cricketers they weren't leaving letters behind, and it was newspapers that documented what was going on, including the politics of cricket, was really covered very closely in the different newspapers of the time, and those were my main resource.
And what I found really interesting was the way in which this tournament, which became famous throughout India, didn't it? It became a tournament that was followed across India. How this kind of began to conflict with the aspirations of the Congress Party or Indian nationalists, who kind of position the Ranji Trophy as a rival kind of competition to it. And there's this struggle between the two in the 30s and 40s. Can you kind of expand on that for me?
Yeah. So essentially, I mean, so if I may again give a slightly expansive answer, the four master categories of my book are race, caste, religion, and nation. So I start with the racial politics of cricket and how the British colonized the best sporting fields in Bombay. And the natives had to play on really badly managed and badly maintained turf wickets. Then I moved to caste, which is the story of the Palwankar brothers, this family of untouchable cricketers who really had to struggle very hard to get recognition for their feats. Then I come to religion, which is the politics between Hindus and Muslims. Now, the Congress Party, which was the main vehicle of the Indian freedom struggle, and whose leaders included such people as Gandhi and Nehru, wanted a composite inter-religious nation in which there was no discrimination on the basis of gender, caste, or indeed religion. Now, once you had a Muslim team, that legitimized the demand for a separate Muslim homeland of Pakistan. So in the 1930s and 40s, when the Congress was strongly challenged by a rival party called the Muslim League, representing the Muslim minority of India. And the Muslim League said, we can't live with Hindus in a single country. We'll be dominated by them. We'll be swamped by them, because not only are they greater in numbers, they have a disproportionate share of economic wealth. They control the professions. So we need our own space in which to develop. Now, at that stage, the Congress Party and Gandhi thought, hey, this cricket tournament run on religious lines is feeding into the demand for a separate Pakistan. And Gandhi came out in the early 1940s to ask for it to be stopped. But by that time, really, the tournament had run its course. But it was quite clear, particularly after the end of the Second World War in 1945, that Pakistan would be created. And of course, that even in cricketing terms, it was the Ranji Trophy, played between different provinces of India, not between different religions, that was now the real showpiece tournament.
And you kind of mentioned the early stage of your book, where you talk about the relationship between the British and the Indians. And I recently interviewed another historian of Indian cricket, Prashant Kidambi, who's also written about those early tours, the Parsi tour to England in 1911. what I found really interesting about your work and Prashant's work is the way that you use the work of the historian and cricket historian Framji Patel, who was one of the sponsors of that tour, I believe. I mean, you talking about archives just now and how cricketers don't tend to leave behind archives during that period. Was Patel one of the kind of key witnesses for the early days of Indian cricket?
So, Geoff, Ramji Patel was a Parsi. And the Parsis were the most westernized community in India and also the most literate and educated. And it's not surprising that they left behind the first cricket histories. Apart from Ramji Patel's book, there's another book by a Parsi called Shahpurji Sorabji, which talks about a conflict between cricket and polo, which I found actually extraordinarily fascinating. The Europeans played polo. And after they played polo, they left the turf that had been dug up by the horses' hooves for the cricketers to play, Indian cricketers to play on the same ground. And there was a decades-long campaign by Indian cricketers to say, Europeans cannot play polo on our field because the quality of the wickets is, it was kind of not just fair play, but it was an argument about conditions, the appropriate conditions on which cricket can and should be played. So the Parsis were really both cricketers and writers. And these two historians, whom both Prashant and I have used quite extensively, left behind these fascinating records. Partly, Shahpurji is mostly about conflict between European polo players and Indian cricketers, and Ramji Patel a more kind of standard narrative documentary history of the growth of Indian cricket.
Yeah, and it really acts as a metaphor for the British relationship with India, doesn't it? And the way in which they kind of control physical space in the city.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and it's such a powerful way to start the book. But of course, later on in that book, you also describe the developing relationship between India and Pakistan and the way in which cricket becomes kind of instrumentalized as a kind of a unifying force in India, but also maybe slightly aggressively as well. How does that process take on?
Yeah, so as I said, the four kind of master categories chronologically are race, which is the late 19th century, caste, which is the first 2 decades of the 20th century, religion, which is the third and fourth decade of the 20th century. And then in 1947, India and Pakistan become independent as sovereign but opposed nations. And then nation takes over. So nationalism is the fourth master category of my book. The growth of the sport in the 50s and 60s, the identification of sporting victory with national triumph, and correspondingly with sporting defeat with national humiliation, and how, though cricket in India always evokes nationalistic, even jingoistic feelings, the most intense parochial passions come to the fore when India plays Pakistan. Its twin from whom it was separated at birth in 1947. And there's some really very ugly manifestations of sporting nationalism when India plays Pakistan, which I describe in one of the later chapters of my book.
And so turning to your more recent publications, this year you published, let me see, sorry, hold on. Sorry, yeah, this year you published the Commonwealth of Cricket, which was about contemporary cricket, really, isn't it? Or at least it's part memoir and then part contemporary cricket. It's really interesting. And I found the early section fascinating because you talk about your youth in Bangalore and the players that you used to watch when you were a child and when you were an adolescent. What's your earliest memory of cricket before you had all of these social and political things going on in your head when you were watching the game? What's your kind of innocent remembrances of cricket?
So, as I say in my book, the first match I watched when I was 4. I grew up in a small sub-Himalayan town called Dehradun. And it was my father was playing that match. And I was told I was there, but I have no memories. The first kind of visual memory I have is when I was about 6, of a team coming from Saranpur, which is across the hills, a neighboring town, and an opening batsman hitting a 6 over the trees, and then the rain coming. That's kind of, and it's vivid in my mind. Then I would spend my summers in Bangalore in South India, which was a much larger town than Dehradun and had a much more established cricketing tradition, where my uncle Dore, who's my maternal uncle, who's really the hero of the early chapters of the book, ran a cricket club which had several Ranji Trophy players playing for it, and which played against other first-class teams or first division teams, which had test players like Prasanna, Vishwanath, Chandrasekhar. So, as a teenager, spending my summers in Bangalore, I came face to face with really the greats of Indian cricket and came to venerate them and worship them. And in one of my early fans' books on cricket, I use an epigraph from Ian Peebles, the English wrist spinner and cricket writer, where he says, "There are no cricketers like those seen through 12-year-old eyes." And I was 12 when I saw G.R. Vishwanath bat and Erapalli Prasanna bowl for the first time. So they always will have that very special hallowed place in my mind. And so the book kind of then moves through my coming to appreciate cricketers from other countries. And actually, it has two chapters on cricketers from abroad. And I'm particularly proud of the chapter on Pakistani cricketers, because despite all our political and national rivalries, there's much to admire about the cricketers from Pakistan. And then, of course, it ends with my accidental, very, very strange tenure in the belly of the beast, being tasked by the Supreme Court to try and clean up Indian cricket, a task in which I, of course, failed lamentably.
Yeah, the section on Javed Miandad in your book, I really enjoyed that, because I remember watching him on television when, I suppose it would have been the early 80s, when I was about 10, 11, 12. And I'd never, I grew up in a very rural part of England, and I'd never seen players like that, because they only came once every 3 or 4 years in those days. So that was probably the first time I'd seen a Pakistan team. And Miandad was amazing. He batted all summer. It felt like he batted all summer that we couldn't get him out. And I really enjoyed the way that you gave some depth to my knowledge of Miandad, because you really go into the style of his play and how significant he was for Pakistan at that time. And what I also found really interesting is like the enthusiasm that you write about the game in this book, but also then the kind of explaining your experience with the IPL and the board of inquiry that you were on, the Lodha committee, I think, which you were appointed to in 2017. Having read that section of the book, what I wanted to ask you is, how do you keep your enthusiasm for cricket in the face of some fairly cynical operators who
I think I, of course, went through a phase of disenchantment when I was in the Supreme Court appointed committee, which followed the Lodha committee recommendations. And, there were a few intense months where I tried to get some best practices implemented and failed. But then fortunately, Geoff, because I have a life outside cricket, my main work is outside cricket, I could, rather than the game meaning everything to me, for example, if I was a full-time cricket journalist who had been appointed to that committee, I'd been much more embittered and soured by that experience. But I kind of took it in my stride. Also because of my work as a political and social historian, I know that cricket is only a game, interreligious violence is much more, or intercaste violence is much more problematic for a country than losing a cricket match. But it took me a year or two for me to get back my love of the game. And I must confess that I actually enjoy watching club cricket, young kids of 17 and 18 making their mark in the Bangalore First Division, or watching a test match in which India is not playing, as compared to a match in which India is playing. The older one gets, the less nationalistic one becomes. And if India is not playing, unfortunately, Indian commentators are incredibly jingoistic. You put on the telly and India is playing, and every ball, the partisanship of the commentator is so nakedly visible. It's not as if Australian and English and West Indian commentators are not partisan. They also want their team to win, but they don't wear their partisanship on their sleeve in that way. So it kind of spoils one's enjoyment. Whereas if, New Zealand is playing South Africa, one is not emotionally invested in the game and one just enjoys the aesthetics of it, right? Or if one is watching one's club play or watching a Ranji Trophy match. Again, the kind of ugly nationalism that marks international cricket doesn't come into the picture at all. So I have certainly got back my love of watching cricket. I think it was wonderful last year during the pandemic when England played West Indies. And then England played Pakistan after that. And it was wonderful for me as an Indian, with all the gloom and despair around me caused by the pandemic, to switch on the telly at 3:30 in the afternoon and watch cricket. And one of the real, how do I put it? One of the upsides for an Indian of watching cricket on television played in England is that it starts at 3:30 in the afternoon for me. So you've done much of a day's work. You don't feel guilty. If it's a test match in India, the whole day goes. If it's a test match in Australia, you have to get up at 3 a.m. Right. So I'd say, and the older one gets, one values and cherishes one's sleeping hours that much more. So it's really nice, and one's working hours too. So I think last year, the test matches in England provided, not just for me, but for cricket fans all over the world, a ray of hope and normalcy at the time of this absolutely unprecedented pandemic.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And that was very much my experience of that summer. And I think wise words as well on the kind of not taking sport too seriously. I think there's some England football fans who could definitely learn a lesson from what you've just said, and just think to themselves, it's only a game. It's only a game. And the enjoyment should come from just watching people who are very good at what they do, or playing yourself, or being part of the crowd yourself. Because I think that's also something that's really interesting, is that experience of being in a crowd. And you kind of bring that across as well in the latest book, the Commonwealth of Cricket, about growing up and the experience of being a fan, but also the experience of being part of a community. And can you tell me some more about your memories of cricket in the 60s and 70s, and how that develops a sense of identity for you? Would you say that it became part of your identity, being a cricket fan?
Certainly. I think watching cricket in Dehradun, playing for my school team, then coming to Bangalore in the summers, and then of course watching Ranji Trophy matches. And I think I was fortunate in growing up at a time when there was no live television. Watching cricket on television, or growing up watching on television, is a kind of a disembodied and solitary experience. So to go to a ground with lots of other people, and sometimes just to watch a club match, or to be playing for your school team and chatting to your friend, with your colleagues, taking a bus to the match or back from the match. And I must say, the radio also was a very important part of my cricketing education. And again, unlike television, where commentators don't have to explain to you, there's a charm and a magic which is now absent with live television, of listening to somebody 1,000 miles away describe a match that is being played in front of his eyes, but you have to visualize. So, for example, Gary Sobers batting with his cousin David Holford at Lord's in 1966 to save a test match. And it was one of my first memories of hearing cricket on the radio against the England fast bowlers, for example, right? Or the famous first World Cup final, when Lilly and Thompson were trying to score the last 30 or 40 runs against the West Indies, and of course the great 100 that Lloyd scored in that match. So I think I've growing up on television shrinks your imagination. Radio expands your imagination. Watching at the ground is a kind of emotional experience that can't be captured watching on television. And as I said, for me, cricket is not only test cricket. It's not only international cricket. It's club cricket, university cricket. And so in that sense, and often with friends. So I talk in my book about a well-known Indian journalist, Suresh Menon, and how I grew up with him, and we watched many test matches together. When there's a test match in Bangalore or a one-day match in Bangalore, I'm often sitting with him. So we are talking, so when Tendulkar scored 100, I remember, Suresh and I talked, comparing him to Gavaskar as to who was the greatest Indian batsman ever. So this, when Kumble is getting all those wickets, then it brings back memories of the other great leg spinner from Bangalore, B.S. Chandrasekhar. So that kind of collective shared experience is very much part of my life in cricket.
Yeah. And to sort of go on to the other strand of your career. So you were talking earlier on about how when you were researching a corner of a foreign field, there were few archives to consult, and so you were relying more on newspaper reports and things like this. With your biographies of Gandhi, which are immense and very rich, there's almost an overabundance of archive, isn't there? Because Gandhi was such a prolific writer and speaker. How do you, as a historian, how do you approach a project that is so colossal?
Well, I think, Geoff, the first thing I'd say in answer to your question is that you have to be reasonably mature, but not with one foot in your grave to attempt such a project. So don't do a huge project when you're in your 20s or your 30s. When you're in your 40s or early 50s, you have an understanding of the complexity of social life. You have a real feel for archives, and you can kind of more expansively plan out your project. You don't have to do it next year to get a promotion. You can take 5 or 10 years and devil hang the professional consequences. So I think both my history of India after Gandhi, and my Gandhi biographies were undertaken when I was in my late 40s and 50s. I mean, I couldn't dream today, I'm 63, of ever undertaking a project of that kind, because I just don't have the energy. Now, one of the things that my cricket research gave me, Geoff, was an appreciation of newspaper archives, which had been underused in biographies of Gandhi. So biographies of Gandhi had relied enormously on his writings, on colonial intelligence reports, but I found that newspapers were an incredibly rich source on what he was doing. For example, to take a very celebrated incident in his life, the March to the Sea, the Dundee March, the Salt March of 1930. Now, if you follow newspapers day by day as these newspapers are tracking his progress, you do so through different kinds of newspapers. So you can see the pro-Congress newspaper, which is called the Bombay Chronicle. You can see how the march is represented in the pro-Congress newspaper, the Bombay Chronicle. You can see how the march is represented in the pro-Raj, the pro-colonial state newspaper, the Times of India, both of which appear in English. Then you can look at the Hindi press, which I also did, and look at a newspaper called Pratap and what it was saying, kind of a bottom-up view. And finally, you can look at Reuters and the Associated Press, what the international media is saying about that same epical event. So you get 4 or 5 different perspectives from which you can piece together a much richer narrative about that march than if you were only looking at the colonial record or at what Gandhi was saying every day, right? So I think in retrospect, researching corner of a foreign field, helped me present a more textured analysis of Gandhi's life, because virtually no Gandhi biographer had looked at newspapers. So, and then I recognized through this book, through writing a cricket history, how valuable newspapers were. So, for example, I found for Gandhi's South African phase, a newspaper called the Natal Mercury, which was the major English newspaper in Durban. And no historian had said, hey, let's look at what that imperialist newspaper is saying, who's organizing protests against racial laws. So I think it was this cumulative experience of the other smaller, more focused projects that prepared me for an undertaking as complicated and, dare I say it, ambitious as a 2-volume life of Gandhi.
Well, it's an ambition that's been fulfilled, isn't it? Because they're magnificent books and magnificently reviewed as well. And I'm really looking forward to reading. I'm going to begin reading the first volume next week. And I'm very interested in South African history myself, and kind of until I sort of became a historian myself, I wasn't aware that Gandhi had such a long and significant career in South Africa before he went on to lead Indian independence. So that kind of leads me on to what are you working on now, Ram? I mean, you seem to be fired up and ready to go.
So I've been working for many years on a book, which I more or less finished, which is about, it's called Renegades. That's the title of the book. And it's about 7 Westerners, 5 British people and 2 Americans who joined the Indian freedom struggle. So it's 7 remarkable individuals who were, you could say, traitors to their race, their religion, and their nationality, and were making this journey in the reverse direction. You know, it's now Indians and Pakistanis who go to Britain or go to Canada or go to America. Here at the height of empire, in the late 19th and early 20th century, there were these 7 remarkable radicals who came to India, joined the freedom movement, went to prison, sometimes fell in love with Indians, campaigned for gender equality, environmental protection, freedom of the press. Really 7 quite exemplary individuals whom I've been fascinated by for a very long time. And I think that apart from my being interested in them, I think their stories also have a contemporary ring, because we live in a world marked by xenophobia and jingoism. You know, the Brexiteers in your country, the Hindu supremacists in my country, the white triumphalists in North America, Xi Jinping and his kind of China is the center of the world kind of stuff, right? Russia, Turkey, wherever you go, there's a kind of there's a kind of a xenophobia at work. And these are stories of, as I said, Christians, white Christians, not sometimes nominally Christians, but who go and take a stand on behalf of another country, another people, in the interest of a more just and fairer world.
That sounds fascinating, and I think you're right. We're not living through the best of times at the moment, or at least it doesn't feel like it now. And one of the other things that is one of the challenges for the world at the moment is the environmental situation and climate change. And at the beginning of your career, you began writing about environmental history, didn't you? I mean, at a time when I guess it wasn't that fashionable. I mean, how did you become a historian of the environment?
Well, largely by accident, Geoff. You know, as I said, I grew up in a town called Dehradun, which is in the Himalayan foothills. And when I started my PhD in 1980, there was a very active movement that later became quite iconic called the Chipko movement, kind of a tree protection movement where the peasants threatened to hug the trees. The Chipko means to hug in Hindi. And it was kind of a grassroots environmental movement led by men and women who lived in the villages of the central Himalaya. And I wrote my doctoral dissertation on that movement. Then I got interested in kind of comparative environmentalism, you know, looking at the early history of environmentalism in your country, and poets like Wordsworth and John Clare and others. And then I then I spent actually the first 15 years of my professional life as an environmental historian. And then I moved towards more political and social history. And though I've retained my interest as a citizen, and it's now, of course, as you said, with climate change, it's something we should all be deeply, deeply worried about. If you see what happened in Canada and in Alaska with climate change, or in Germany most recently. And I'm not doing any serious research in that field anymore, but I keep a close tab on it, and I'm in touch with younger scholars who are doing outstanding work.
That's wonderful. And before we wrap up, I think that you've agreed to give the keynote lecture at next year's conference. And I really hope that you'll be able to come to the UK to give that in person. That will be over this pandemic by then. But again, congratulations on the Howard Milton Award. And thank you very much for speaking to me today.
Thanks, Geoff. And I also very much look forward to being there at your annual meeting next year and meeting all of you in person.
Okay, I'm going to stop the recording now.